Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen adjusted her uniform one final time before stepping into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the base administrative building. The morning briefing would start in exactly 12 minutes, and she had learned long ago that arriving early meant avoiding unwanted attention. Her boots made soft, measured sounds against the polished concrete floor as she navigated the familiar hallways of Fort Braxton. The other soldiers barely glanced her way as she passed. At 5'4" with an unremarkable build, Sarah had perfected the art of blending into the background. Her service record was clean, her performance evaluations consistently above average, and her interactions with fellow soldiers remained professionally cordial. She preferred it that way. Colonel Davidson's voice echoed from the briefing room ahead, already holding court with his usual mixture of war stories and thinly veiled intimidation tactics. Sarah had been stationed at Fort Braxton for 8 months now, long enough to understand the unspoken hierarchy that governed daily life here. The colonel commanded through fear and favoritism, and those who challenged his methods found themselves reassigned to less desirable duties. Sarah took her assigned seat in the third row, pulled out her notepad, and prepared for another morning of keeping her head down and her mouth shut. She had no way of knowing that today would be different. Today, everything would change in ways she never could have imagined. Where in the world are you watching from, and have you ever served in the military or known someone who has? Colonel Davidson strode to the front of the briefing room with his characteristic swagger, his chest adorned with ribbons that spoke of decades in service. His eyes swept across the assembled soldiers before landing on Sarah with an uncomfortable intensity that made her shift slightly in her seat. "Good morning, soldiers," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Today we discuss readiness protocols and I expect your full attention." His gaze lingered on Sarah longer than necessary before moving on. The briefing proceeded as expected until Davidson began discussing weekend duty assignments. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes on the new security procedures when she noticed the colonel's attention returning to her repeatedly. Each time their eyes met, his expression carried something that made her stomach tighten with unease. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Davidson called out suddenly, causing every head in the room to turn toward her. "Perhaps you could enlighten us about proper uniform standards since yours seems to need adjustment." Sarah's uniform was impeccable, and everyone in the room knew it. A few soldiers exchanged uncomfortable glances while others stared straight ahead, unwilling to become involved. Sarah stood slowly, her voice steady as she responded, "Sir, my uniform meets all regulation standards." Davidson's smile was cold as winter steel. "Is that so? Maybe you should stay after this briefing so we can discuss those standards more thoroughly." The implication in his tone made several soldiers shift uncomfortably in their seats, but none dared to speak. The briefing room emptied quickly after dismissal, soldiers filing out with the practiced efficiency of those who recognized brewing trouble and wanted no part of it. Sarah remained seated as instructed, her hands folded calmly in her lap while Colonel Davidson shuffled through papers at the podium with deliberate slowness. When the last soldier disappeared through the doorway, Davidson approached her with measured steps. His expression had shifted from professional authority to something far more predatory. Sarah kept her breathing steady and her posture military straight, though every instinct honed through years of specialized training whispered warnings. "You know, Chen," Davidson said, stopping just close enough to violate professional boundaries, "I've been watching you since you arrived at my base. You carry yourself like you think you're special, like you're better than the other soldiers here." Sarah met his gaze directly, her voice remaining respectfully neutral. "Sir, I follow all protocols and complete my duties to standard. If there's a specific issue with my performance, I'm ready to address it." Davidson's laugh held no warmth. "Performance," he repeated, the word dripping with innuendo. "Oh, I think we definitely need to discuss your performance." He moved closer still, and Sarah could smell the coffee on his breath mixed with something that made her skin crawl. The colonel's behavior had been escalating for weeks, but this crossed into territory that demanded careful navigation. Sarah's training had prepared her for many scenarios, but dealing with a superior officer's inappropriate advances required a different kind of tactical thinking. Sir, with respect, I believe this conversation has moved beyond professional boundaries, Sarah said, her tone remaining steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. Perhaps we should schedule a formal meeting with another officer present to discuss any concerns about my service. Davidson's expression darkened at her suggestion. You think you're clever, don't you, Chen? Always by the book, always proper. But I've been in this man's army for 23 years, and I know when a soldier needs to learn her place. He stepped even closer, backing her against the empty chairs behind her. The briefing room suddenly felt much smaller, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across Davidson's face as his professional mask slipped away entirely. Your problem, Staff Sergeant, is that you don't understand how things really work around here, he continued, his voice dropping to an ominous whisper. You think following regulations protects you, but I am the regulations on this base. Sarah calculated distances and angles with the automatic precision of someone whose training went far beyond standard military instruction. The colonel had no idea that his intimidation tactics were being assessed by someone who had spent years learning to neutralize threats much more dangerous than an overconfident officer drunk on his own authority. I understand perfectly, sir, Sarah replied quietly. The question is whether you do. Her words carried a subtle warning that Davidson was too arrogant to recognize, too confident in his position to realize he was cornering something far more dangerous than he imagined. 3 days later, the entire base buzzed with anticipation for the quarterly readiness inspection. 282 soldiers stood in perfect formation on the parade ground, their uniforms pressed to razor sharpness under the unforgiving morning sun. Sarah maintained her position in the third rank, her expression neutral as visiting brass from division headquarters took their places on the reviewing platform. Colonel Davidson strutted before the assembled troops like a peacock displaying his plumage. This was his moment to shine, his opportunity to demonstrate the iron discipline he claimed to maintain at Fort Braxton. The inspection had proceeded flawlessly until he decided to make an example of someone. Staff Sergeant Chen, step forward, Davidson commanded, his voice carrying across the silent formation. Sarah moved with crisp precision, her boots clicking against the asphalt as she approached the colonel's position. Every eye on the parade ground focused on the small drama unfolding before them. Davidson circled her slowly, his inspection theatrical and deliberately humiliating. Your uniform appears acceptable today, Chen, but appearances can be deceiving. Tell me, what makes a good soldier in your opinion? Sarah's response was textbook perfect. Sir, a good soldier follows orders, maintains standards, and serves with honor and integrity. The colonel's smile was predatory. Integrity, he repeated loudly enough for everyone to hear. That's an interesting word choice from someone who questions her superior's authority. Have you ever witnessed someone challenge authority inappropriately and face the consequences? The visiting officers shifted uncomfortably on the reviewing platform as Davidson's interrogation grew increasingly inappropriate. General Morrison, the division commander, frowned at the display but remained silent, unwilling to intervene publicly and embarrass a fellow officer. Davidson stepped closer to Sarah, his voice rising so every soldier could hear his words. Perhaps you need a reminder about respect, Staff Sergeant. About knowing your place in the chain of command. Sarah remained at attention, her eyes fixed straight ahead as Davidson's behavior deteriorated before nearly 300 witnesses. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, but the tension radiating from the formation was colder than winter steel. Sir, I have always shown proper respect to the chain of command, Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly across the silent parade ground. Several soldiers in the front ranks exchanged glances, recognizing the careful precision in her words. Davidson's face flushed red with anger at her composed response. Have you now? He snarled, moving so close that his breath touched her cheek. Because I think you need a lesson in what happens to soldiers who forget their place. The colonel's hand began to rise, his intention clear to every person watching. 282 soldiers held their breath, sensing they were about to witness something that would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet staff sergeant who kept to herself and never caused trouble. What would you do if you were in this situation, watching authority being abused so publicly? Time seemed suspended as Davidson's hand continued its upward arc toward Sarah's face. The parade ground had become a theater of absolute silence, broken only by the distant sound of flags snapping in the morning breeze. Every soldier in formation understood they were witnessing a moment that would define careers and reputations. General Morrison finally stepped forward from the reviewing platform, his voice cutting through the tension. "Colonel Davidson, perhaps we should continue this inspection in a more appropriate manner." But Davidson was too far gone, too invested in his public demonstration of authority to back down now. "This soldier needs to learn respect, General," he replied without taking his eyes off Sarah. "Sometimes lessons require emphasis." Sarah's breathing remained controlled, her muscles coiled with the precise tension of a steel spring. Years of specialized training had taught her to recognize the exact moment when violence became inevitable, and that moment was approaching with mathematical certainty. The watching soldiers began to understand that their quiet, unremarkable staff sergeant was not what she appeared to be. Something in her posture, something in the way she held herself as Davidson's hand rose higher, suggested depths they had never imagined. Private Martinez in the second rank would later tell his squad that he saw Sarah's weight shift almost imperceptibly onto the balls of her feet. Sergeant Williams would swear that her hands, still positioned at attention, had somehow changed their angle by mere degrees. This reminds us that everyone has hidden depths waiting to be revealed. Davidson's hand reached its apex, hanging in the air like a sword of Damocles above Sarah's composed face. The colonel's breathing had become labored with rage, his professional facade completely abandoned in favor of raw intimidation. He had crossed every line of military conduct, and now stood poised to cross the final one. "You will learn respect, Staff Sergeant," he hissed through clenched teeth. "One way or another." General Morrison took another step forward, his voice sharp with command authority. "Colonel, stand down immediately. This behavior is completely unacceptable." But Davidson was beyond hearing reason, beyond recognizing the dangerous territory he had entered. His hand began its descent toward Sarah's face, and in that instant, everything changed. Sarah's eyes met Davidson's for the first time during the entire confrontation. What he saw there should have warned him, should have made him reconsider his course of action. Instead of fear or submission, he found himself looking into the calm, calculating gaze of someone who had been waiting patiently for him to make exactly this mistake. The watching soldiers sensed the shift in atmosphere like animals sensing an approaching storm. Something fundamental was about to happen, something that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about power, authority, and the quiet staff sergeant who had endured weeks of harassment without complaint. Sarah's muscles tensed with surgical precision as Davidson's hand swept downward, and time itself seemed to slow as 282 witnesses prepared to see justice delivered. The moment arrived with crystalline clarity. Davidson's hand descended through the final inches of space between authority and assault, between professional misconduct and criminal behavior. Sarah had endured weeks of harassment, maintained perfect military bearing under increasing pressure, and now faced the ultimate test of her training and character. In the split second before contact, Sarah made her decision. Years of specialized combat instruction compressed into a heartbeat of perfect calculation. She would not be a victim, would not allow this abuse to continue, and would demonstrate once and for all that respect could not be demanded through intimidation. The watching soldiers saw Davidson's hand suddenly stop mid-swing, caught in Sarah's grip with movements too fast to follow. What happened next would be discussed in barracks conversations for years to come, analyzed and reanalyzed by witnesses who struggled to believe their own eyes. Sarah's counter-movement was a masterpiece of applied physics and martial precision. She redirected Davidson's momentum with surgical accuracy, using his own force and body weight against him in ways that defied his understanding of combat. The colonel, who had expected to strike a defenseless subordinate, instead found himself completely helpless against someone whose training far exceeded anything he had encountered. The sound that followed was sharp and unmistakable, echoing across the parade ground like a rifle shot. Davidson's scream of pain and surprise shattered the morning silence as his arm bent at an angle that nature never intended, leaving him writhing on the asphalt. The parade ground erupted in stunned silence as Colonel Davidson collapsed to his knees, clutching his broken arm against his chest while tears of pain and shock streamed down his face. 282 soldiers stood frozen in formation, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Sarah remained at attention, her breathing steady and controlled as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The entire sequence had lasted less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds had fundamentally altered the power dynamics of Fort Braxton forever. General Morrison rushed forward, his face a mixture of shock and professional concern. Medical personnel were already sprinting across the parade ground, their equipment bags bouncing as they responded to the obvious emergency unfolding before the entire base. "Sarah," General Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying a tone of dawning recognition. "What unit were you with before your assignment here?" Sarah's response was delivered with the same crisp professionalism she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "Sir, I served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, specialized in close-quarters combat instruction and threat neutralization." The general's eyes widened as the implications hit him. The quiet staff sergeant who had endured weeks of harassment without complaint was not the helpless victim Davidson had assumed. She was a highly trained special operations soldier whose restraint had been the only thing protecting the colonel from his own stupidity. Around the formation, whispered conversations began as soldiers realized they had been witnessing a predator unknowingly cornering someone far more dangerous than himself. Share this with someone who needs to see that respect is earned through character, not demanded through intimidation. The medics reached Davidson within moments, their professional training taking over as they assessed the damage to his arm. The break was clean but severe, requiring immediate stabilization and transport to the base hospital. Davidson's moans of pain provided a stark soundtrack to the unfolding drama. General Morrison turned to address the formation, his voice carrying across the parade ground with absolute authority. "All personnel will remain in formation until further notice. What you have witnessed today will be investigated thoroughly and appropriately." Sarah maintained her position at attention, though every soldier on the parade ground now looked at her with new eyes. The unremarkable staff sergeant who had blended into the background for 8 months had revealed herself to be something extraordinary. Sergeant Major Thompson approached from the reviewing platform, his weathered face showing grudging respect as he studied Sarah with professional interest. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "that was textbook defensive tactics. Clean, precise, and completely justified given the circumstances." Sarah's response was characteristically modest. "Sergeant Major, I used only the minimum force necessary to protect myself from assault. Colonel Davidson's injuries resulted from his own aggressive actions and momentum." The watching soldiers began to understand that they had witnessed more than just a physical confrontation. They had seen justice delivered with surgical precision by someone who had endured harassment with remarkable patience until left with no alternative but self-defense. Word of the incident spread through Fort Braxton like wildfire, transforming Sarah from an overlooked subordinate into a legend whose quiet strength had finally been revealed under the most dramatic circumstances possible. 3 weeks later, the official investigation concluded with Colonel Davidson's dishonorable discharge and criminal charges for assault and conduct unbecoming an officer. The witnesses who had stood in formation that morning provided testimony that painted a clear picture of harassment, abuse of authority, and ultimately assault. Sarah received a commendation for her restraint and professionalism throughout the ordeal. General Morrison personally delivered the recognition, acknowledging that her patience and adherence to proper channels had given Davidson every opportunity to correct his behavior before facing consequences. The culture at Fort Braxton transformed overnight. Soldiers who had previously remained silent about inappropriate behavior found their voices, knowing that courage and integrity would be supported rather than punished. Sarah's example had shown them that true strength often wore the quietest faces. In the weeks. 3 weeks later, the official investigation concluded with Colonel Davidson's dishonorable discharge and criminal charges for assault and conduct unbecoming an officer. The witnesses who had stood in formation that morning provided testimony that painted a clear picture of harassment, abuse of authority, and ultimately assault. Sarah received a commendation for her restraint and professionalism throughout the ordeal. General Morrison personally delivered the recognition, acknowledging that her patience and adherence to proper channels had given Davidson every opportunity to correct his behavior before facing consequences. The culture at Fort Braxton transformed overnight. Soldiers who had previously remained silent about inappropriate behavior found their voices, knowing that courage and integrity would be supported rather than punished. Sarah's example had shown them that true strength often wore the quietest faces. The quiet staff sergeant continued her duties with the same humble professionalism she had always shown, but now her fellow soldiers understood the depth of character and skill that lay beneath her unassuming exterior. She had proven that respect cannot be demanded through intimidation, only earned through honor, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who appears most harmless. Fort Braxton never forgot the morning when justice was delivered with surgical precision by someone who had endured harassment with remarkable grace until left with no choice but to defend herself. This story reminds us all that everyone deserves respect, and true strength protects rather than intimidates.